Everybody, hello and welcome to today's program. Today we will be hosting a conversation with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, hosted again by American Muslims for Palestine, an education and advocacy organization. We're going to also host an incredible variety of speakers from different backgrounds, including Dr. Yara Hawari, Mariah Kaplan, Sari Bashi, Fakhri Diab, Mohammed El-Kurd, AMP's own Managing Director Josh Rubner, and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. We are so excited to have everyone on, and we're excited to hold this event. And we would like to have a special shout out to the organization, If Not Now. They're co-sponsoring this event, and If Not Now is a progressive American Jewish activist organization that opposes the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. We're going to kickstart with Dr. Yara Hawari, who is a senior policy analyst over at Al-Shabaka.
Thank you so much for having me on and for organizing this important and timely conversation. I hope that everyone watching is safe and well in these difficult and unprecedented times. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the pandemic for Palestinians in Palestine. And we know that many health systems around the world are struggling with the pandemic, but the West Bank and Gaza are confronting COVID-19 from a reality of Israeli military occupation, which has weakened the ability of Palestinians to respond effectively to this virus. This context of 53 years of occupation is incredibly important to understand. What has happened is that over decades, Israel has deliberately disrupted Palestinian medical capabilities in the West Bank and Gaza, meaning that they don't even meet the basic standards. This includes tight restrictions on imports, meaning that there is often a shortage in equipment, medication, and even staff. And in Gaza, many essential medicines are actually consistently at zero stock, and this means that there's less than a month's supply. Israeli restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement also means that it's very difficult for Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza to travel to receive proper care, because basically they're at the mercy of the Israeli regime as to whether or not they receive permits. And then this is not to mention the frequent military bombardments and military raids on Palestinian medical facilities. So this was the context pre-pandemic and the challenges that Palestinians faced when it came to their healthcare. So you can see that the added disaster that has been the pandemic has only made things 100 times worse. And in addition to that continuous structural violence, Israel is also engaged in much more insidious attacks against Palestinians who've been trying to confront the virus. COVID-19 clinics have been totally destroyed, such as in Area C. Palestinian volunteers have been arrested for trying to help vulnerable Palestinian communities. There was even a call from the international community to Israel to stop home demolitions, when actually in 2020 we saw the number of Palestinian home demolitions double, rendering the pandemic motto, stay at home, a really very cruel irony. Now, Israel has been pursuing this narrative that it will vaccinate its citizens first before helping neighbors, including Palestinians. And this is an incredibly misleading narrative for several reasons. Firstly, because Palestinians aren't simply neighbors. Palestinians are living under Israeli occupation. There isn't a border between Israel and Palestine. Israel is actually the sole sovereign entity that exists, and Palestinians are squeezed into tiny Bantustans. Now, the international legal regime and the international consensus agrees that Israel is an occupying regime, and legally, as an occupier, Israel alone is responsible for the health and the well-being of those that it occupies. And this is clearly stipulated in Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which states that the occupier has a duty of ensuring the adoption and application of the prophylactic and preventative measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics. So in other words, Israel has a legal obligation to procure sufficient amount of COVID-19 vaccines for Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. Now, Israel has also been using the Oslo Accords as an excuse, saying that the Palestinian Authority is supposed to provide for its own citizens, which out of context might sound plausible. I need not remind you all that the Palestinian Authority was indeed created by Oslo as a service provider, as an interim structure until Palestinian statehood, was achieved. Now, the Palestinian state hasn't come to fruition because it was fundamentally a flawed agreement. But if we put that aside, Israel has also undermined Oslo at every juncture and turn. And so for them to use Oslo as an excuse is incredibly hypocritical, but it's also not legally sound, because the Oslo Accords do not and cannot trump the Geneva Convention. And this has been reiterated time and time again by legal experts. Now, increasingly, the situation is being called by human rights organizations and activists vaccine apartheid or medical apartheid, as a reflection of just one of the manifestations of apartheid playing out on the ground. Palestine isn't particularly unique in the fact that it's not receiving vaccines fast enough or that its health system is not able to cope. And nor are Palestinians necessarily more deserving than other vulnerable communities. But the reality of one group of people being vaccinated over another group of people that are effectively under the same governing regime is what makes this situation particularly stark. The fact that a healthy young Israeli settler is getting vaccinated and just a kilometer away from him or her, an elderly, vulnerable Palestinian is not getting the vaccine. This is a very clear manifestation of apartheid. And just to put that in numbers, over 50% of the Israeli population has been vaccinated with both doses of mostly the Pfizer vaccine, whilst according to Palestinian Authority numbers, less than 1% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been vaccinated with both doses. And the rollout of the vaccine in the West Bank and Gaza has been incredibly slow. And that's because the number of vaccines that the Palestinian Authority has been able to acquire are really very few. We're talking around 200,000 doses that have arrived in the West Bank and Gaza for a total population of 5 million. And meanwhile, amidst the pandemic, the military occupation and apartheid regime doesn't stop. There hasn't been a reprieve from Israeli violence. As I mentioned earlier, 2020 saw the number of Palestinian home demolitions double in number. And this has included entire communities such as the Hamsa village in the northern Jordan Valley, and also across the so-called Green Line with the Palestinian Bedouin Al-Araqib village in the Naqab, the Negev, which has been destroyed nearly 200 times now. Most notably at the moment, families in Sheikh, a neighborhood in Jerusalem, which I lived for in many years, are facing imminent eviction from their homes. And of course, we know why Palestinian homes are being demolished. They're being demolished in order to steal Palestinian land and to make way for Israeli settlers. So business as usual continues, and it also continues with Israel's regime of detention and incarceration, including of Palestinian children. In 2020, Defense for Children International documented 79 Palestinian child detention cases from the West Bank, in which they detailed widespread and institutionalized ill treatment of Palestinian child detainees. The vast majority said that they were physically abused by Israeli forces during the course of their detention. And more severe cases included threats of sexual violence and actual sexual violence. And other than children, thousands of Palestinian political prisoners languish in Israeli prisons, which have incredibly poor sanitary conditions and virtually no health provisions. Prisoners were complaining via human rights organizations throughout the pandemic that the Israeli authorities were not doing enough, were not providing enough precautions to prevent the spread of COVID. Luckily, only very recently, many prisoners have now received the vaccine. And these prisoners are held in military prisons. They're tried in military courts, which have a 99.9 conviction rate. And this is really something that characterizes Palestinian life in the West Bank and Gaza, incarceration and prisons. We all have friends and family members, or both, who have been incarcerated by the Israeli regime. And since 1967, Israel has incarcerated more than 800,000 Palestinians. And this massive structure of incarceration doesn't just affect the individuals who are in prison, but also their families and their communities. It's very much a defining feature of Palestinian life. Under the military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, if the Israeli regime wants you, they can take you. And I want to share a brief story which encapsulates the system of incarceration in Israeli military prisons. On Monday, the Israeli regime released a man called Majd Barbar, who was imprisoned for 20 years. He was arrested 15 days after his daughter was born, leaving his wife to take care of 2 young babies without him. On Monday, as I said, he was released after 20 years of not seeing his family. He was finally reunited with his wife and now grown-up children. The next day, the Israeli regime arrested him once again. They held him for an entire day just to hammer home that just as they can give him his freedom, they can take it from him in a split second. Luckily, since then, Majd has been released. And this Israeli regime structure of violence doesn't happen in a void. It happens with the help, the complicity, and the inaction of the international community and other international actors. Just to give you an example, various international companies such as JCB, Hyundai, Caterpillar continue to allow their heavy machinery products to be used in demolitions and settlement construction that violate the human rights of Palestinians. Another example is the global sportswear manufacturer Puma, which is the main sponsor of the Israeli Football Association, which includes teams in Israeli illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian land and also has operational licenses in illegal Israeli settlements. And this is not to mention governmental support, such as the US's military aid package of billions of dollars of US taxpayer money, which contributes and even incentivizes Palestinian human rights violations. And it's important to note that these connections and the fact that Palestine is not some random obscure issue, but one that is connected to larger structures of oppression. And on this, I'll end, that just as those structures of oppression are connected, so too are the struggles against them. And so Palestine becomes understood as not simply a Palestinian struggle, but a class struggle against corporate companies and sellout capitalists, a struggle against colonialism and white supremacy in all its forms, and even, when they manifest in liberal and allyship dressings. And finally, not least of all, it's also a feminist struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yara Hawari. You made some incredible points on the violence perpetrated against Palestinians at every level, within every system, within the carceral system, judicial system, healthcare system. I'm so happy to introduce Josh Rubner, AMP's Managing Director, who will now introduce Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Malek. My name is Josh Rubner, Managing Director for American Muslims for Palestine. I'm filling in for our Executive Director, Dr. Osama Abuirshaid, who unfortunately got called away at the last minute due to some personal circumstances and sends his regrets for not being able to be with us here today. But that gives me the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our next guest, a person who needs no introduction at all, but someone who is going to get the introduction of fulsome praise that she so richly deserves, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who represents the 13th District of Michigan in the U.S. House of Representatives. She's now in her second term in office, a member of the legendary Squad, a progressive warrior for justice, self-described mother working for justice for all, who was born and raised in Detroit, the eldest of 14 children, I believe, raised by Palestinian immigrant parents. She is the first Palestinian American woman in Congress, and she sits on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and Financial Services. She is such a tremendous warrior for justice, for racial justice, for environmental justice, against environmental racism, and of course, speaking out so eloquently and passionately for Palestinian rights. Congresswoman, you've already done so many amazing things for Palestinian rights in your very, very short tenure in Congress. We thank you so much for joining us today, and we're so grateful for everything that you do in Congress and for who you are.
No, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you to the powerful just conversation, Dr. Yara, that was really powerful. Thank you all so much for continuing to speak truth to power when it comes to Palestinian human rights. I'm so pleased to be with AMP, and always wonderful to be in space with all of you. I'm so deeply appreciative of your continuation in the work of bringing equal rights and dignity for Palestinians. As you all know, 2021 is shaping up to be a really critical year for advocacy on the Palestinian cause. The work we are doing is establishing that you cannot claim to be progressive and a supporter of human rights or a social justice advocate if your vision for justice does not include Palestinians and resistance to the Israeli occupation. I want all of you to know that on the ground organizing you are doing is making a huge difference in the institutions of power, including Congress. Just last month, many of my colleagues and I sent a number of congressional letters to President Biden and the administration that urged them to put diplomatic pressure on Israel to comply with international law and respect Palestinian human rights in regards to vaccinations, home demolition, annexation, and more. I think it's important to note that the State Department letter that myself and Representative Mark Pocan led is the first official congressional correspondence to refer to the Israeli occupation as what it is now, which is settler colonialism. Just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have 12 members of the United States Congress refer to Israeli occupation as colonialism. So have no doubt that the needle on Palestinian human rights is moving. I also want to touch really quickly on COVID pandemic and the impact of the movement for Palestinian dignity. The pandemic has reinforced what we all already knew about the Israeli occupation, that it threatens the lives and the well-being of Palestinians, not only through military violence, but by denying access to adequate health care. Israel has also been receiving praise for its high vaccination rate of its citizens, but let us be very clear. Under international law, Israel is responsible for providing vaccinations to all Palestinians living under its occupation. And it is not just the lack of COVID vaccinations for Palestinians that is an issue. It is only one facet of the larger issue, which is medical apartheid, a system that delays and stops Palestinians from traveling through military checkpoints to access healthcare, a system that blocks Palestinians in Gaza from leaving to seek specialized treatment they can only find elsewhere. They can only find in those places. As progressives and advocates for social justice, we need all of us to continue to raise awareness of how the systems that oppress Palestinians in Israel and occupied Palestine are mirrored here in the United States, where racism in our healthcare system means that Indigenous and Black Americans die at more than twice the rate of our white counterparts. Just as the systems that oppress us are interconnected, our struggles for freedom and equality must be as well. When I see the United States sending nearly $4 billion in military aid to Israel, I not only see money to support occupation, but our tax dollars that could be used to fund healthcare here in my home district, one of the poorest in the nation. This is just one example of the need to stop investing in war and start investing in healthcare. And as you all know, I won't stop fighting until that happens, and I know neither any of you. Thank you, and I look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, for your incredible insight. We're really excited to have a conversation with you, with the other speakers. And our first question is from Dr. Yara Hawari. Dr. Yara, please feel free to go ahead.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for your intervention. You mentioned that the term settler colonialism was quite a big step for a congressional letter, and it certainly is. I wanted to ask about that term specifically, and also about apartheid and how it applies to Palestine. For many of us on the ground, we use settler colonialism and apartheid to talk about Palestine from the river to the sea, and because they are definitions that encompass all of Palestine and speak to really Palestinians as a whole, I wanted to ask what sort of led you and your colleagues to go for that definition and why it was important.
I mean, it was just very clear for me. As everyone knows, I'm pretty direct about the injustices, and referring to Israel's illegal settlements as a form of settler colonialism is exactly what it is. It's describing the reality of what the Netanyahu government is doing. They're building illegal settlements for settlers to colonize Palestinian land. And as the word apartheid, you all know, it literally means separateness. So when you have separate roads and license plates and a distinct set of laws for different populations in your country, that is an apartheid system. And I saw it firsthand. My grandmother has a separate color pass, this little ID card. She can't go through certain roads. She's treated completely different. There's 2 separate lines at various checkpoints. So for many of us, and including, some of the leading human rights organization in Israel, all officially have deemed the current system as one of apartheid. Sis, I don't know why. You just can't. You got to get unmuted.
Terrible.
That's why
Terrible.
I smiled.
Our next question is from our representative from the organization, If Not Now, Mariah Kaplan. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for being here and for all of your work. We're really thrilled to be co-sponsors of this event. I wonder if you can speak to the role of allies in the struggle for Palestinian rights and specifically for the role of Jewish folks.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said this, and it's, like I've continued to mention this over and over again, that the systems that oppress us are so interconnected. Our struggles for freedom and equality, is as well. And I've been so inspired, by my Jewish neighbors here locally, who have stood with me in protest of water shutoffs and, pushing for a moratorium on evictions and so much more, and the incredible work. So I know a lot of my Jewish neighbors are speaking truth to power and demanding that human rights of Palestinians are respected, because it is in very much, I think, for many of us, we understand that connectivity. I mean, I come from a community is one of the most beautiful, blackest cities in the country. And I see firsthand, just how much our freedom and equality is so connected. And for us, it's just real and authentic in how we approach this. And I see millions of, folks joining us in this effort of fighting against this form of oppression, which is so painful to see. And, and again, I can't stress enough how much I feel, and I know it's not just me, just how much those freedoms, again, are impacting all of us when we do the things and oppress others, that how much that pain will result in, impact all of us. So again, it's so interconnected. And I just learned early on, you don't wait until it's your community that is targeted. You don't wait, and there's no hierarchy what community gets hated the most, or hierarchy of how painful oppression is. All of us know that pain, and we all need to fight against it. And that's why I think this continuation of allyship is so critically important. I learned through watching the history of the civil rights movement, that's where the power really came, is when people from all different backgrounds came together and fighting against inequality.
And to that point, Congresswoman, AMP, we have many, many constituents in your district who absolutely love you for repping Michigan. Can you tell us a little bit more about the parallels you see regarding vaccine distribution in both your district and in Palestine as well?
So for many that are listening, you might not know this, Michigan, it's about less than 15% Black population. And even though the COVID deaths in Michigan are close to 40% are African Americans. And so many of my Black neighbors, because of the oppressive and racist structures that were in place prior to the pandemic, you can see resulted in a higher rate of death and a higher rate of not being able to access, quality health care, or, some of the pre-existing conditions that exist because of environmental racism and so much more. And so for me, being my roots as Palestinian, but also being in this beautiful Black community, I can see how these oppressive policies, these ways of, providing for one community and not providing for the other community, which are neighbors, really resulted in more illnesses, more sickness, and more death for many of my Black neighbors. I represent the third poorest congressional district, and if you look around, the economic divide, the systems that have really been deteriorated or set up in a way that's racist, all of that is very much more evident now during the pandemic. and can be so interconnected to what you see is happening in Palestine. And that's why I'm constantly saying, from Detroit to Gaza, water should be a human right, water access. When you deny people access to water, it's a form of violence. It creates so much trauma, and it's led to public health, to human dignity, and so much more.
Thank you so much for your answer and your answers to all of the questions. This was an incredible conversation that I'm sure a lot of us can revisit, and you are such an inspiration. And many people in the plight, in the pursuit of justice, look up to you, and thank you again for all that you do. And thank you for, holding this program with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And sister, before I go, I do want to share with all of you, my mere existence is obviously creating this dialogue around Palestine, but I hope that we are being intentional about how our fight for human rights in Palestine is so connected to the human rights movement around the world, and including here in the United States. And so I hope to see more of us fighting against the hate towards our Asian sisters and brothers, fighting against the oppressive policies and structural racism that we see in our Black communities, including trying to end mass incarceration, trying to fight against the poverty war on our people, and so here at home. And so make sure that you all are being intentional about that, because again, that pain and what we see it happening to our families in Palestine are so much in line and connected to why we fight so hard here at home. And so I just hope we're very intentional about that work. That's how we can really build and understand the struggle. And really, that's how we also put the human face to that struggle.
Most definitely. And it's a duty and a commitment and obligation to justice, like as a principle. So thank you so much for that, Congresswoman. Awesome. Next, we're going to have up speaker Sari Bashi. Sari Bashi is the research director with Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN.
Great. Thank you so much to American Muslims for Palestine, as well as If Not Now, for hosting me. And it's been an honor to listen to both Yara and Congresswoman Tlaib. Thank you. What I would like to do is to pick up a bit where Yara left off in terms of what's been called vaccine apartheid in Israel-Palestine. I would like to offer an update about how the discriminatory vaccine distribution regime has affected rates of infection for Israelis and Palestinians. And then I want to suggest that actually the distribution policy is an opportunity to shift the discourse on Israel-Palestine. There's something about discrimination in COVID-19 vaccines that actually is more conducive to getting us beyond a statist, symmetrical conflict resolution paradigm that is certainly very common in the United States, and helping us promote a broader rights-based framework in which we describe what's happening not as a conflict between two symmetrical parties, but rather a system of domination based on ethnic identity or apartheid. And I want to end with suggestions and maybe a wish list for how there could be some actually good advocacy within the United States vis-a-vis the pharmaceutical companies that are providing the Israeli government with COVID-19 vaccines. So I'll just I'll pick up from where Yara left off in terms of the vaccine distribution regime in Israel-Palestine. So in the beginning of the pandemic, both the Israeli and Palestinian authorities imposed lockdowns, and for most of the pandemic, infection rates followed a similar trend. So they were always higher in Israel for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the Israelis have more ability to travel, and the virus was coming in from outside. So for a while, the closure actually protected Palestinians from the coronavirus, especially in Gaza, where very draconian measures were taken to try to keep the virus out. And the first reported case in Gaza came only in August. But since then, there's been a kind of tandem where the infection rates rose and fell together in both Israel and Palestine with occasional lockdowns. That all changed in December, which is when the vaccines started arriving in Israel as part of a special agreement, initially with Pfizer, although with others as well. And the idea was that Pfizer would give Israel vaccines early, and in exchange, Israel would provide real-time reporting on the effectiveness of the vaccine. And at this point, the Israeli government has actually obtained more vaccine than it needs. There's enough vaccine for all Israeli citizens and residents, with extra left over. And some of that extra is now being sent out to countries in Latin America and Africa as part of COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy. Right now, 60% of the Israeli population is partially or fully vaccinated, and less than 1% of Palestinians have received a vaccine at all. So Palestine is very much in the middle of a third wave. Schools and most businesses are closed. There's evening and weekend curfews. Hospitals are at or over capacity. The death rate is climbing. There's very little testing, and the positivity rate is about 25%. So that gives you a sense of a pandemic that is not under control. In contrast, within Israel, people are really reaping the fruits of vaccination. The economy has opened up. Shows, concerts are now taking place for the first time in a year. And there's a drastic reduction in infection rates. Hospitalizations are down, death rates are down. And the positivity rate in Israel in terms of coronavirus testing is 1%. So that's a pandemic that, thank God, is under control. I think that contrast actually is relevant for the evolving discourse on Israel-Palestine. I think there's something about the starkness of that contrast and about the humanness of not just the way that we are all vulnerable to coronavirus, but our very human need for vaccine that has pushed surprising people to actually push for Israel to be more equitable in its COVID vaccine distribution policy. So certainly the international community has overwhelmingly pushed the Israeli government to distribute vaccines, not based on ethnic criteria, but based on medical criteria, meaning it would include the 5 million Palestinian residents of Gaza and the West Bank who live under Israeli control. But even the mainstream newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, every article that addresses Israel's success in vaccinating its own citizens, almost every article has also raised questions about the discrimination. And even within Israel, public health officials, the former head of Israel's coronavirus response, have called for the Israeli government to provide vaccines to Palestinians, if only because it makes sense from a public health perspective. I think there's something about this issue, the starkness of the discrimination and the humanness of the need, that provide an opportunity to go further in going beyond a statist paradigm for Israel-Palestine. So certainly in the United States, but in other places as well, people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as if there were two states, the Palestinian Authority or the State of Palestine and the Israeli government, and they are in a conflict, and we can judge the moral worthiness of either state, and that will determine whether or not people should have rights. I think that activists within the United States, and certainly Congresswoman Tlaib and the people she works with, have done an amazing job in moving past that toward a rights-based framework and a framework that talks about apartheid and domination. I think that there are reasons why the vaccine argument can move us forward, and it's because of the vulnerability of the Israeli counterarguments. So the Israeli government has said that it is not responsible for managing the virus in Palestinian territories. And that's very interesting because in every other context, the Israeli government calls those territories belonging to the Jewish people. So for purposes of settlement, for purposes of annexation, the territories are Jewish, but when the people living on them get sick, it's a Palestinian problem. That disconnect is becoming more obvious. And in addressing the Israeli reasons why not to provide the vaccine, we have a chance to actually say a lot about domination in Israel-Palestine. We have a chance to say this is actually not only about a military occupation, although it's also about that. It's about a broader system of ethnic discrimination and ethnic hegemony. And so one way to pick that apart is to look at the Israeli argument about citizenship. So the Israeli government has said, look, Palestinians are foreigners, they're not citizens, it's not our responsibility. But then we have a chance to talk about how people become citizens of Israel, right? It's a chance to talk about, well, actually, citizenship is something that is distributed based on racial characteristics. And I mean, it's also very constructed, of course, right? So nearly half of Jews in Israel are actually Arab Jews, like my father, right? But Israel categorizes people as either Jewish or Arab, and then says the Jewish people can become citizens. Beyond that, of course, there's the idea that the 5 million Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, nearly half of them are actually refugees from the Green Line, from the internationally recognized borders of Israel-Palestine. So it's a chance to say, well, yes, they're not citizens, but why are they not citizens? And then, of course, there is the broader Palestinian diaspora, which is another element of the way in which the Israeli authorities engineer demographic superiority for Jewish people by preventing the right of return. So I think that there's something about vaccines that lets us talk about that in a way that it opens up new audiences. And I want to suggest, and I'll close with this, that there's a particular audience within the United States that we might try to address, and that's the pharmaceutical companies. So both Pfizer and Moderna are supplying Israel with vaccines. AstraZeneca may also do so. Pfizer and Moderna, I'll say it this way, if we view the Israeli vaccine distribution policy as a human rights abuse, not a foreign policy issue between two states, but a human rights abuse, then that kicks in legal obligations, legal responsibilities for the pharmaceutical companies under what's called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Basically, companies have obligations to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations or products through their business relationships, even if they have not contributed to those adverse human rights impacts. So that means that even if the companies themselves are not discriminating, if they are supplying the Israeli government with vaccine, knowing that those vaccines are being distributed according to ethnic criteria as opposed to medical criteria, they have an obligation to engage the Israeli government. They have an obligation to ask questions. They have an obligation to try to mitigate the discrimination, to take steps to try to prevent those adverse human rights abuses. There's a range of things that we can ask of them. Pfizer is based in Chicago. Moderna is based in Cambridge. At the very least, they should be answering questions about what they are doing to prevent that kind of vaccine discrimination. And to be clear, there are a host of human rights issues that are raised by the pharmaceutical companies' contracts with states. And inequality in vaccine distribution is not unique to Israel-Palestine. There's something about the starkness of giving vaccines to Jews and not to Palestinians, other than the Palestinian citizens of Israel, that kicks in extra human rights obligations for the pharmaceutical companies. Palestinian human rights groups have already written to both companies, and I think there's room to support that work by insisting that at the very least, American companies will not be part of the discrimination.
Wonderful insight. Thank you, Sari. I really like the idea of pulling in the pharmaceutical companies that you mentioned, because they definitely must be responsible for something like this that is happening. And you spoke a lot to the racial disparity and the racial violence that's being perpetrated against the Palestinian people with the use of vaccine. So thank you so much for your insight. That was much, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mohammed El-Kurd, who is a writer from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. His family has been battling settler colonialism in Sheikh Jarrah since 1972. It's great to have you on, Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you putting this together. It's a joy to be able to speak about this. My name is Mohammed and I'm from Sheikh Jarrah, and 30 days separate me, less than 30 days actually separate me, my family, and my community, 126 Palestinians to be exact, from being forced into homelessness by the Israeli regime working in collusion with billionaire-backed settler organizations in Jerusalem. To give you a little background about Sheikh Jarrah is inhabited by refugees, meaning my grandmother, my father all lived through the Nakba in 1948, and they were displaced from their homes brutally, and they were forced into exile. And then in 1956, the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Campaign, and the Jordanian government worked together, collaborated to create a housing project for Palestinians. And that housing project became Sheikh Jarrah. And they gave 28 houses for 28 Palestinian families that then became a larger-than-life, beautiful Palestinian community. Today, we are confronting ethnic cleansing in our community. And on May 2nd, 2021, in less than 30 days, almost half of the community will be forced into homelessness. It's quite sad and stark to talk about. I've been talking about this since 2009 for 11 years, as half of our home was already taken by Israeli settlers. And I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember all of the brutality of that. Many of our neighbors have already lost their homes to Israeli settlers in the past, in 2009, and we have been talking about this for years and years and years, trying to get somebody to do something to save our communities from ethnic cleansing. But the story of Sheikh Jarrah is not a unique one, and the fact that my father, who's been displaced in 1948, had already been displaced again in 2009, and then again he will probably be displaced on May 2nd. It's heartbreaking to think that the Nakba is not only continuous, but it happens to you more than once. It's not only ongoing, but it's ongoing for you, certainly for you individually. Not that we've been displaced once and that's it. We are continually getting displaced in our own country, in our own homeland. But it's not unique because it's part of the larger Israeli project to Zionize Jerusalem and take over the city. And this is a clear demographic game. There's many measures that Israel implements to take over our lands, to demolish our homes, to evict us from our homes, to take over our Jerusalem residency so that we no longer can access Jerusalem and we're rendered to live in the West Bank, because Jerusalem is an increasingly gentrified and expensive city, and those of us who will lose their homes can certainly not afford to live in Jerusalem anymore. And for us who live in Jerusalem, those of us who live in Jerusalem, really the evident bias of the Israeli courts is implied, right? This is my occupier's court, and my occupier's goal is to occupy me and steal my land and give it to the settlers. And the judge always happens to be a settler, and the jury are settlers. So we cannot win against a system that was invented to displace us and dehumanize us and ethnically cleanse us. We cannot win against a system that was made by and for Israeli settlers to help uphold the goals of settler colonialism in historic Palestine. The Israeli judicial system creates racist and supremacist laws that allows them to take over our homes and, effectively ethnically cleanse us under legal measures. Such laws include the 1950 absentees property law and the 1970s legal administrative matters law. And it's so much, it's literally a system that was designed to displace us. It is a system that was designed to take over our hand. It is a legalized order of ethnic cleansing. When people say that Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood is getting orders of eviction, we are getting legalized orders of ethnic cleansing. And this is a violation of international law because, as you all know, the Israeli regime has no jurisdiction over East Jerusalem according to international law. And it's ethnic cleansing because although they take their time and they make it seem like this is one case or two cases, and they separate the legal battles, so each family is left on their own to battle the Israeli judicial system for decades. For example, in the Sheikh Jarrah case, we have been doing this since 1972. We have exhausted our financial resources, our psychological well-being, our futures. I'm 22 years old, and this is the only reality I have known. My father is 76 years old, and this is the only reality I have known. I have measured my time by when the next court case was since I was born. It's been my life, right? And they do this to exhaust us, and they do this to separate our legal battles so that it seems that it's not mass eviction and it's not mass displacement. But in fact, it is, and it's happening all across Jerusalem. It almost happened in Khan al-Ahmar. It's happening in Silwan, where over 100 homes are slotted to be demolished by the Israeli army, which will leave 1,500 people homeless. So it is mass eviction, and it is ethnic cleansing, and it is a war crime. And it's particularly sad because, as I said earlier, it's kind of difficult to even talk about, but as I said earlier, our parents have already gone through this in 1948. And we hear their stories and the similarities, the parallels, the mirroring of those stories is really terrifying. But also the thought of what could happen to our parents on those days, on May 2nd, 2021, is really scary. As I said, my father is 76 years old. Please forgive me. And I don't want him to go through this. And none of our parents should be doing, like, I speak to our neighbors, to our friends. None of our parents should be doing this. They're all elderly and they should be resting instead of battling this monster of ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. We're dealing with settler organizations, oftentimes headquartered in the United States. They are billionaire backed, and every few weeks we hear about them getting more and more donations from different Zionist billionaires around the world, and we have nobody. We don't have any resources, and we're constantly working and trying and pleading to save our community. But the power dynamic is so starkly inadequate and so starkly unequal. So yeah, I don't want my father to go through this for the third time. My grandmother, Rifqa, who died recently, this would have been like her fifth time because of how many times she's had to leave her home forcibly because of the massacres and the Zionist gangs raiding the villages in 1948 and 1967 and so on. And also, it's worthy of mentioning, like so many of the people before me said, that we are in a pandemic, and regardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not, nobody should be losing their homes to squatters and to thieves. But particularly in a pandemic, we should be staying home. The World Health Organization is urging us to stay home, and instead we're going to be thrown onto the street. And as I said, we cannot afford an alternative. We'll be on the street. So I'm hoping Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and those of us and those who work for justice for all are listening to my testimony right now. It's quite difficult to actually talk about this, I'm realizing. And I'm hoping that Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and everybody in Congress work on establishing firm political stances, be it inside the Capitol or on Twitter and social media, to save our neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, and other neighborhoods like Silwan and Batan al-Hawa, where thousands of Palestinians are about to be thrown in the street in less than 30 days. And I'll end this quite frankly. I'll say I don't want to be a number. You know, we often talk about people who are facing this, and we talk about them in numbers, and we say 1,500 people are losing their homes, 28 families are losing their homes, 1,400 were killed. I don't want to be a number. I don't want my neighbors and my loved ones to be statistics. I don't want Sheikh Jarrah to be mourned in history books or Nakba remembrance museums in a few decades, because our Nakba is right now, and we need action right now. Everybody watching has an obligation to speak out against this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, so much for sharing all that and telling your story and telling your family's stories. It's obviously a deeply traumatizing history of Palestinian eviction, ethnic cleansing, and there's something especially sinister about the way the legal system and the law is used to legitimize all of that. And thank you so much again for your insight. It's absolutely invaluable. We're actually going to have a speaker up next who is from Silwan, a resident of Silwan, whose name is Fakhri Abu Diab. And Fakhri Abu Diab is based in East Jerusalem, and he's a spokesperson for the Silwan Defense Committee. Thank you so much for coming on.
تحية لكم وشكرا للإضافة وللاستضافة على يعني هذا البرنامج الذي سنوصل فيه إن شاء الله رسالتنا لكم بداية وللكونغرس وللعالم أيضا من خلالكم.
Shukran, thank you for coming on. Just a note to the audience, I'll be translating in some. Once Fakhri is complete with his talk, I'll give a brief translation and summary at the end. Thank you.
يعني بداية يعني حقيقة نحن هنا في الجزء الشرقي من القدس 340 ألف شخص يعيشون تحت الاحتلال وفي نظام أبارتهايد كامل. لا نملك أي حقوق لا مدنية ولا سياسية ولا حريات، ولا تسمح لنا بلدية القدس أيضا بالبناء بطريقة قانونية ورسمية، لأنها بالنهاية تريد طردنا، ولذلك هي لا تعطينا تراخيص بناء.
Based in East Jerusalem, Palestinians have no rights legally, socially, and they are essentially restricted to a second social class and deprived of rights that Jewish nationals or Israelis typically would enjoy.
نعم، وأنا يعني لو أخذنا مثال هنا في سلوان التي تقع جنوبي السور البلدة القديمة، وأيضا جزء منها يسمى حي البستان الذي أنا أتواجد فيه الآن والذي أعيش فيه، وتريد البلدية هدمه لأسباب سأتناولها أيضا فيما بعد.
This is exemplified now in the region of what's happening in the region of Silwan in specific neighborhoods like Hayy al-Bustan as well. And I will speak to the experiences and what's happening there now.
نعم، هذا الحي اللي وهو جزء من سلوان مهدد بهدم 100 منزل، أكثر من 1500 شخص وأغلبهم أطفال يعني يعيشون في الشوارع بدون مأوى، لأن البلدية ومن ورائها المؤسسة الرسمية تخطط لطردنا وهدم هذه المنازل بادعاء أنها يعني أرض تاريخية وتمثل إرث حضاري للشعب اليهودي.
What's happening in particular in this neighborhood is that 100 homes are on the eve of being demolished, and this is placing the lives of 1,500 people, many of them children, placing their lives at risk.
وطبعا يعني في صراعنا مع البلدية التي ادعت أن هذه المباني بنيت بدون ترخيص رغم أنها أغلبها بنيت قبل 67، ولكن البلدية لا تعطينا أصلا تراخيص للبناء، ونحن بحاجة للبناء في أراضينا وفي أحيائنا.
And the system, the legal system, the civil system is essentially allowing occupation of this land to happen and depriving Palestinians of any legal way to remain in their homes or keep the land that they have and they've owned historically.
وطبعا نتيجة الضغط والضغط المحلي والضغط حتى الدولي، اتفقت البلدية مع المحامين الذين يدافعون عن البستان بأن نقوم بإعداد ماستر لمخططات هيكلية، و10 سنوات ونحن نقوم عن طريق مهنيين بهذه المخططات، وكلفنا مئات ألوف الدولارات، ولكن في النهاية البلدية لأن الأمر سياسي رفضت كل هذه المخططات والاتفاقيات وتريد هدم المنازل وطردنا ونصبح بالعراء.
And we've been resisting these measures for a very long time. We've invested a lot of resources, financially and otherwise, into trying to maintain ownership of our land and our homes, but to no avail.
نعم، ورغم أننا ندفع الضرائب أولا لدولة إسرائيل وثانيا للبلدية، ضرائب باهظة ندفع لها، وخاصة المنازل التي تدعي أنها غير قانونية وتريد هدمها تلزمنا بدفع ضرائب خاصة للبلدية على هذه المنازل، وفي النهاية جزء من هذه الضرائب بدل أن تقدم خدمات وهي لا تقوم بأي خدمات لنا، تقوم بشراء جرافات لهدم منازلنا وطردنا وتهجيرنا.
We are subject to taxes, both to the state of Israel and also our locality, but the issue is that in many ways they are illegal. They are being placed upon us disfavorably. It's a special tax, and it's essentially a way to dissuade us from maintaining ownership over our homes and our land in Palestine.
وفي النهاية طبعا يعني رغم أن بلدية الاحتلال والمؤسسة الرسمية الإسرائيلية رغم أن هذا الأمر مخالف للقانون الدولي وأيضا مخالف للقانون الإنساني، ولكنها نتيجة عدم وجود ضغط حقيقي لا من المجتمع الدولي ولا المؤسسات الدولية، فلذلك هي تتقوى علينا، ونحن بشر نريد العيش بأمان وسلام ولا نملك أي قوة، ولكن لعدم وقوف العالم والمجتمع الدولي معنا هذه المؤسسة ستقوم في النهاية بهدم منازلنا وطردنا وإبقائنا يعني بدون مأوى.
And the state of Israel will, of course, have its own self-serving laws and policies and judges and attorneys. And while this might not violate Israeli state law, it definitely violates humanitarian international law. And there must be pressure coming from human rights organizations, from different governments globally to put an end to this, because the state of Israel will not stop until it is stopped.
وطبعا لما البلدية طلبت هدم منازلنا وأرادت إقامة حديقة في هذه المنطقة، عندما قمنا بمخططات هندسية وبديلة قبلنا أن نقوم نحن بعمل حدائق بالقرب من منازلنا في محيط منازلنا، ولكن البلدية تريد أن تقيم هذه الحدائق على منازلنا، أي أن تكون مكان منزلي حديقة، وأنا وزوجتي وأطفالي وأحفادي ننام في الشارع ونكون في الشارع، لأنهم بالنهاية يريدون طردنا وليس مجرد تخطيط وترتيبات هندسية.
What's happening is the implementation of dispossession. It's a complete structure built on pushing people out of their homes, the communities that they've lived in for years.
نعم، يعني هناك سياسة طرد وتهجير لأنهم لا يريدوننا في هذه المنطقة في الوقت الذي لا يسمح لنا بالبناء، ويقولون أن هذه المنطقة لا يجوز البناء فيها. المستوطنين بالقرب من منازلنا يعطونهم تصاريح ويقومون بالبناء بشكل طبيعي، ومن ثم واضح هنا أن السبب والهدف هو إبعادنا وإحلال هؤلاء المستوطنين مكاننا وأخذ أراضينا.
And there's a lot of manipulation in trying to push people out of their homes, out of the communities that they've been in for years, but it's very clear what they want to do. It's very clear that the end to this goal is ethnic cleansing. It is the dispossession of Palestinians from their homes and their land.
وللعلم يعني رغم أننا يعني نعاني حتى يتم الهدم، وقد هدم بعض المنازل، نحن نعاني معاناة كبيرة ومعاناة ضخمة جدا، ولكن نسأل يعني أين هو المجتمع الدولي؟ أين هي العالم الذي يجب أن تحافظ على حقوقنا؟ أليس أقل حق للإنسان والذي كفلته الأمم المتحدة والمواثيق الدولية أن يقوم أو أن يكون له بيت ويكون يعني في منزله؟ ولكن للأسف يعني إسرائيل فوق القانون الدولي والعالم يصمت، وهذا ما يؤلمنا، وهذا ما قد يؤدي إلى يعني تصرفات من قبل الناس المظلومين ربما يعني هي ما لا يريد أحد.
And we're suffering. The home demolitions are extremely difficult to endure and to try and survive and live through. And is it not from our human rights to have a home, to live in our own home, free of fear of persecution and exile? But it seems that Israel has a grip, it has a hold above international community standards. And there's no pressure, there's no significant pressure to stop the exile of Palestinians like myself from our homes.
وطبعا يعني للعلم قبل أن أكمل أو أنا أريد أن أعطي مجال، حيث أنني لا يعني نعم نحن نعاني، المؤسسة الإسرائيلية تريد هدم والبلدية هدم منازلنا، نحن نطالب بتدخل المجتمع الدولي، ولكن إذا أراد شخص من الضيوف التعليق أو السؤال فأفضل إعطاء يعني وقت معين قبل أن ينتهي وقتي.
Palestinians want pressure from the international community. They want pressure from governments around the world to essentially influence Israel and the crimes that they're committing against Palestinians. And if there are any guests who would like to provide any additional comments or insight, please definitely feel free to. Thank you so much, Fakhri Abu Diab. It was a pleasure having you. Shukran كثير. Shukran jazeelan. Thank you all for attending today's program, our conversation with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. We had some incredible speakers, some incredible questions, incredible insights given from everybody today. And the topic of home demolitions, the topic of unequal COVID-19, or just medical apartheid in Palestine is definitely pressing. Thank you for attending. Thank you for learning with us. And please be sure to follow AMP on social media at AM Palestine, and also go and sign up for our mailing list, because there will be action alerts ready to go very soon so that you can also take action on these horrific issues that are developing in Palestine. Thank you again for your time, and have a great day.